Good afternoon and welcome to our Moving to France post-Brexit webinar. My name is Andy Bridge from A Place in the Sun. Thank you for your time today. We do appreciate you joining us, whether it's on the Zoom call or you're live streaming on Facebook. We also appreciate the questions that so many of you have sent in ahead of today's event. There's clearly a strong desire to move to France still, which is good to see. And we have taken the content of those questions to frame today's webinar and try and give you the answers that you so desperately require. By its nature, today's content is going to be fairly dense, lots of detail, lots of nitty-gritty, but I'm pleased to tell you I'm joined by an expert panel who are going to make it informative, entertaining, and exciting, no doubt. So let me introduce them to you first of all. And let's start with Joanna. Joanna Leggett, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Andy, over here in France.
Just to be clear, you don't get the choice of being erudite or informative or exciting. I expect you to be all three today, so no pressure, okay?
Yeah, no problem at all.
Tell our audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you are, and what you do for a living.
Okay, well, I'm Joanna Leggett. I'm part of the Leggett family, Leggett Immobilier. So we started the business about 22 years ago now, from a little office in the Dordogne. We now cover the whole of France. We've got over 750 agents based all over France. So we cover any area that clients buyers or sellers might be interested in. We've got about 14 regional offices as well, so we can help with all sorts of problems or questions. Yeah, I think and so obviously we're here, we've got a website which you can have a look at. We're on Place in the Sun website as well. We've got loads of experience and really here to help. The market at the moment is very strong, particularly with French buyers, but luckily we still are letting the Brits are still able to come over.
So principally you're an estate agency, but again, by its nature, you get asked lots of questions to do with residency and relocation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the role of an estate agent in France is quite different to that of the UK. I mean, I've got children into schools and things like that. So although legally, I would always advise that you do look at the government websites for the information, and it does change regularly. So do check every day. However, we do offer a hand-holding service, and we've all moved from the UK, so we've all been through that. So, we can help with other questions as well. And some of the questions that I'll have today, although I can give you my opinion and our view on them, I would always double check them with the government website on a daily basis as things change. Okay,
and Yvonne Drolshagen, let's turn to you now. Welcome. This is the first time we've done our webinar, so that's good to meet you. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, with a pleasure. First of all, thank you for having me on this webinar today. So I'm Yvonne Drolshagen, and as my family name might tell you, I'm German, but I live in France for 35 years now. I'm an independent financial advisor and insurance broker, and have been working with and for experts for more than 15 years in the southwest of France. And based on the needs that my customers had for, let's say, hand-holding services, some years ago, I have created with some very nice people the company called Aquitaine Lifestyle Solutions. So today we are a hand-holding service with complete relocation services that includes, as I said before, financial advice, insurance brokerage, whatever you need when you want to relocate to France. Yes, we are out there to help you and to guide you through the multiple layers of French administration and struggle with papers, etc., etc. We, yes, as I say very often to people when they contact us and to relocate to France, we will be your best friends for at least a year, because I think that's what people have to understand. Things take time when you relocate to another country. It's not a one-day adventure.
Sure.
It's for a longer time. Yes.
Good. Thank you, Yvonne. And welcome back, Rob Kay. Share your story with our audience, please, Rob.
Good afternoon, Andy. Unlike Yvonne, the journey with Blevins Franks is sort of, excuse the expression, but soup to nuts. we tend to try and find people who are arriving in France. Blevins Franks has been around now for 47 years. We've advised expatriates who are moving to France. We specialize in France, Spain, Portugal, Cyprus, and Malta. And what we do is we make sure that your affairs are arranged appropriately for those countries that you go to. So from a French point of view, as I was about to say right at the start, the journey begins hopefully before you arrive in France, because there are certain things that you need to do before you leave the UK to prepare. And that's even more relevant these days, as people who haven't arrived under the withdrawal agreement carte de séjour system are going to have to apply for a residence permit before they leave the UK. So it gives us actually a better opportunity to start the planning process and rearrange, if required, all their assets and their affairs appropriately for France. But that process doesn't stop there, it continues, which is why we have a network of partners and offices across France. When I started with Blevins Franks 25 years ago, there was just two of us, two men and a dog, I think is the expression. Now I've lost count of how many clients, prospects, and staff we have in France, just because of the volume of people that we advise. Because our job is to not only bring people in, but to continue advising them on an ongoing basis. Because quite a lot of, certainly British expatriates, they need advice from both sides of the channel. Quite a lot retain assets in the UK. So therefore, a UK budget, like we saw a couple of weeks ago, will impact even French residents. And obviously, being a French resident, you get impacted by the French budget every year. So there are things that are happening all the time. So it is an ongoing process.
Okay, thanks, Rob. We're going to kick off with a question that we had in a few days ago from Angie Needs, who was asking, can we travel to France at the moment to buy a property? We're looking to rent for a few months and buy one whilst we're there. We want to get over there as soon as possible. We sold our property in the UK last year. So yesterday there was an announcement from the government that the criteria and the reasonable excuses for international travel allows people now to go and look at a second property, and even to be involved in the purchase or preparing that property for rental. It seems to have acquired the name of the Stanley Johnson clause, seeing as he travelled to his villa in Greece last summer to do something similar. So obviously people now can do that from the UK, but what's the reciprocal arrangements in France? Joanna, do you want to answer that one? If I was in Angenie's shoes, could she now travel to start looking at property with you in France, given the COVID situation?
Yes, you can. I mean, we're doing viewings all the time. There's a lot of Brits that already came here because of the residency before the 31st and are renting, but we are allowed to do viewings, and we do respect all the COVID safety regulations, whereby the vendor can't be in the property, the doors have all got to be open, we can only take 2 people at a time. However, they are allowing, if you're buying a permanent residence, they are allowing you to come from the UK and do viewings. And hotels and places like that are actually open if that is the reason why you're coming. But you're not allowed currently to come here for a holiday. So that's the difference. So if you were coming to your holiday home, apparently at the moment, the law is that you can come to your holiday home to prepare it for sale, but you can't come to your holiday home to holiday in it. But as far as buying a property, you are allowed to come to look at properties to buy.
And you could come to a property to prepare it for rental, I understand, as well, if you're fortunate enough to be an existing owner. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yes, you can.
Okay, and again, the focus of today's webinar is people looking to make a permanent move. But Yvonne, if I can ask you, what's been the most significant change for British people looking to buy a holiday home and not move there permanently since the end of the withdrawal agreement?
I mean, really the most important change after the 1st of January is that up to now, everybody was used just to move very freely. You jump in your car, you take the road south, and some hours later, you are in your holiday home or future holiday home without any restrictions or without any questions. Today, whenever a British citizen wants to come to France and is not already a resident under the withdrawal agreement, uh, you are allowed to stay in France a maximum of 90 days in a 180 days period. And if you go over these 90 days, or you think that you will go over these 90 days, you have to apply for a visa before you come to France. So it is not something you drive down and then suddenly you decide to stay a little bit longer. That might be quite tricky, because you are supposed to leave the country at the end of the 90 days, and then back in your native country, so in the United Kingdom, apply for a visa before you can come back to France. These are the rules today.
Okay, so yeah, that's the most significant change then, isn't it? That will satisfy some people who just want to take intermittent holidays, but if you were looking to spend from September to March in your holiday home in the south of France, then that's no longer permissible at the moment.
In this case, you have to apply for a visa, yes.
Okay. And again, just covering off some things before we move to the crux of today's matter. Joanna, something that hasn't changed is the purchase process. Is that fair to say? The process involved in securing your property, that hasn't had any effect, the fact that we've now out of the EU?
No, not at all. The purchase process is the same whatever nationality you are, because obviously we've been selling to Australians, Americans, people that have been outside the EU for many years. So it's exactly the same process. You make an offer on the property, you have the compromis de vente, which is the exchange of contracts, a 10-day cooling off period, after which time you pay your 10% deposit, and then perhaps 3 to 4 months later, you have the acte de vente, which is the completion. And that is the same for any nationality, whatever country you're coming from. The process is exactly the same.
Okay, Rob, we had a lot of questions in about residency, tax residency, and clearly there's a lot of confusion around those terms. Say if I'm a holiday homeowner, I comply with the 90 days out of 180, I maybe rent out my property for some of the rest of the time. What's the situation there with declaring that rental income? Where does that take place?
There's nothing changed, Andy, with regard to that. It's exactly the same as it was before Brexit. French rental income has to be declared in France, and you pay French scale rates of tax and French investment tax charge, or social tax charge on that income. But if you're also a UK resident, you shouldn't forget that needs to be declared in the UK. And because of the double tax treaty, and you know, from a tax treaty point of view, nothing has changed with Brexit. The double tax treaty still stands, so you won't pay tax in both countries, but you need to make sure that you do declare the income in both countries.
Okay, so irrespective of not being there more than 90 days, I'd still declare the tax locally and pay the tax locally, but that could be offset against tax payments in the United Kingdom.
You got it.
Okay, very good, thank you. So we're now out of the EU. A lot of people still want to go and spend time in France. There's concern about this 90 and 180 days. Yvonne, what are the options for staying there longer than that period at the moment?
As I said, if you want to stay more than 90 days in this 180-day period, and we have a lot of questions of how does this work? How do you count these 90 days? Perhaps just one short line about this. In fact, at any single date, you look backwards on a 180-day period, and you count the days that you have spent in France. If you are under the 90 days, you are fine. And if you reach the 90 days, you are supposed to leave the country. Okay. So that means, and that is really the big change, that today you have to preview more your stay in France. It cannot be as spontaneous as it was in the past. So if you plan to stay in France more than these 90 days, or you have already spent, I don't know, 30 days, and now you want to spend another 90 days in this 180 days period, you have to apply for a visa with the French authorities, and that means in the case for the British living in the United Kingdom, it's the French consul in London that is dealing with these visa applications.
And can you give us some detail then on the specific types of visas that are available? If we consider the visa de long séjour, what's involved in that, and who is that relevant for?
The visa long séjour is relevant for, once again, all those that want to stay more than the 90 days. And then you have different types of visas. In fact, it is more or less linked to what are the reasons, what are your reasons to come to France. I would say, to make things quite simple and understandable, it is not worth today to go through the different types. There is one for visitors, another one for people who will work in France, another one for people who want to register a business in France, create a business in France. There is a website in English from the French authorities that is called francevisas.gouv.fr, but I'm sure you will have this in the documents that people can consult after this webinar. And you just answer some questions. And that gives you a guideline, and that gives you the answer by the end of the 1 page and, let's say, 5 or 6 questions. What is the type of visa that you apply for, and what are the documents that you need, and what are the requirements to get this visa? Don't make up your mind with should I go for this or this kind of visa, or what is the name of the visa I need to apply for. Follow the guideline that was set up by the French authorities, and that's really the best way to go forward for these visa questions.
But would you say these visas are readily available? So if I had a holiday home and I plan to spend 4 months consecutively there each winter, is this something I could do in a pretty straightforward fashion each year, just acquire that visa and happily spend more than the 90 out of 180 days there comfortably enough?
Yes, in principle. When I say in principle, it is that the COVID-19 situation has changed a little bit things. In general, that's how it will happen and how it should happen today. And for the last months, the activity and the visas from the French consul in London, the whole service was really disturbed and is still disturbed. I had an exchange with them a little bit earlier this week. You have to understand that, in fact, the French consul has a subcontractor to organize the meetings that people have, collecting the documents, etc. And they are their offices in London, in Birmingham, and I think it's Edinburgh, if I'm not wrong. For example, the non-London offices, for the time being, are still closed. So that is something that, unfortunately, we have to keep in mind, that we are not facing the normal delays, and I cannot tell you today how long it will take before we are back to something normal for the visa applications. Otherwise, yes, and I join Joanna, what she said before, that we have the experience with Americans, New Zealand, South Africans. It is exactly the same procedure. And in general, it's straightforward. But once again, do this before you leave the country. You really need to apply for the visa before you do anything else.
Okay. And there will clearly be a set of requirements, some of them financial, Rob. What's your experience of people coming to you who are looking to arrive on these sorts of visas, I guess potentially as a door to ultimately attaining residency?
Yeah, I mean, there are some basic monetary requirements, but I mean, in France, there is a monetary requirement and a monetary amount, an income called the SMIG. But in essence, if a couple has income in excess of about 1,200 euros, that meets the financial requirements. If you then apply for a visa and you obtain the visa, you normally have to apply for the visa 90 days before you want to move and to go. But then 3 months after you arrive, you then need to, or within that first 3 months, you need to validate that visa, which is, go on the website, provide the information, pay a fee, confirm that the information that you've given is correct. But then if you want to stay beyond that 12-month period, within 2 months before the period expires, you need to make an application for residency to the local prefecture. And it seems to be the way that most people are setting their strategy up for arrival in France. Arrive on a long-term visa, get here, and then sort of at the 9-10 month point, at that point, then apply to the local prefecture.
So this process, just to break it down from the interested parties of our audience looking at this, some people who just want to spend 4 or 5 months there consecutively could regularly go down this process route. Would they equally be required to show proof of income of that? No. I think you said £1,200. That's per month, presumably.
Yeah, no. If you're coming for a short period of time, you're not going to be, let's say, here more than 180 days, or that's not the intention. You don't necessarily need that requirement. So therefore, it's a reasonably straightforward process. Once the process starts, and as Yvonne said, it is fraught with difficulties because of the visa offices at the moment. And actually, the visa offices are sort of slightly unsure of their footing on this just at this moment in time, I think. But again, I think that's down to COVID and the difficulties of staff and people working from home. Yeah,
so pandemic aside, which would be lovely to be in that situation, that these visas satisfy both groups of people looking to spend a bit more than 98 of 180 days at a holiday home, but they also satisfy the requirement of somebody looking to stay there the year and subsequently move to the process to applying for full residency. Would that be right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And what does that process look like? Who wants to pick that question up? Joanna or Yvonne, the move from one of these long séjour visas to actually applying for residency?
Well, once again, oh, sorry, go on, Joanna.
No, you carry on, Yvonne, that's okay.
Once again, you have to be very clear when you apply for the visa, for what purpose you come to France. I give you one example, and we had this issue several times with the, for example, American or Canadian customers. If you apply for a visa as a visitor and you come to France as a visitor, and then you change your mind, and for example, you want to create a business, you will be completely stuck because your visa as a visitor does not allow you to work in France or to create a business in France. In this case, you have to go back to the authorities, explain that you did change your mind and that you want to change the type of visa that you have. Changing the type of visa can be very long, and in some cases, we just recommended our customers to wait for the renewal of the visa. And then when the visa was to be renewed after, for example, a year, then to change the purpose why they were in France. So that's perhaps the first thing to understand. You cannot come as a visitor and then change your mind in the middle of your stay in France without then changing the whole administration side of things and the papers that you have. If you come to France with a visa with the intention to take residency in France, you then, let's say the visa is the key that opens the door, but once you are in France, then you have to apply for a residence permit, a carte de séjour, okay? And that is then something that is done with the local préfecture and the OFI, that's the Office Française pour l'Immigration. And you will be invited to an interview. You have to produce a lot of paperwork, and that's the way how things go.
And what sort of timeline is there? So you have that initial annual visa, and then you're looking to apply for residency. What are the subsequent steps, or what sort of time period are you looking at before you acquire residency, roughly?
I mean, there is something else that you have to understand, and Rob might perhaps add some lines to this. If you stay in France more than 6 months, the real question that will come up is, do you become French tax resident? Now, the double tax treaty is not talking about 6 months and 1 day. That is what we hear sometimes from customers. In fact, the double tax treaty says to clear where someone's tax residency is, we first look into where is your center of life. What does it mean? I always quote the example of a customer of ours who is a mining engineer working 10 months a year somewhere in the world, but his wife and his children are in France, and the children go to school in France. So there is no doubt that the center of his life, his family, is in France, and he is definitively a French tax resident. If we do not have a clear indication by the center of life, we then talk about the center of your economical interests, etc., etc. There is a list of criteria that we go through when we look into the double tax treaty, and one of the final criteria, if we still do not know where you have your tax residency, is your passport, your citizenship. And be aware of the fact that if you are around 6 months, 6, 7, 8 months, there might be a conflict also between the double tax treaty and the French way to look into residency and the UK residency test, if you are still tax resident in the UK or if you have become a tax resident in France. So be very careful about this. There are the different layers. There's the residency application with the French authorities, and then there is the question of the tax residency.
So Rob, what do you say to a typical British couple looking to go through this process and ultimately become French residents? What considerations do they need to give to existing UK assets, whether that's property or pensions, before they look to move to France?
It's quite. It sounds like a very short. Well, it is a very short question, but with a very, very long answer. I'll try to summarise it.
You're just trying to justify your fees and expertise, aren't you, by saying it's...
Oh, I can do that. Don't worry about that. No, the bottom line is that the UK assets are not always appropriate for French lifestyle. You know, it's most... If you look at any taxes, whether it's income tax or capital gains tax, the description is the same. So if we take income tax as an example, income tax in France and income tax in the UK is called exactly the same thing. You peel the layers away, and one layer below that, everything starts to get different. So therefore, in the UK, income tax is calculated on an individual basis, whereas in France, it's on a household basis. Now, capital gains tax in the UK, you have an allowance. In France, allowances disappeared quite a number of years ago now. So therefore, you might also have tax-exempt investment structures in the UK, but you move to France and they're no longer tax-exempt. So this goes back to what I was saying a little earlier, which says that, look, if you've got something that's tax-exempt in the UK, it would be logical to get rid of it and therefore realise any capital gains it has accumulated before you arrive in France. Because if you subsequently then have to get rid of it, or need to get rid of it, or want to spend some of the capital, you'll pay tax on it. So it is that balance of understanding what you've got, where it is, you know, even just down now to retaining UK property. A classic that we're coming across at the moment is, I suppose, a classic that I'm sure Yvonne and Joanna have seen many times, where Brits have moved to France, but they have this wish to remain having a foothold in the UK. So they keep their UK property. Now, you know, we're in a situation now where we have this in the UK, in this budget that just went ahead in the last 2 weeks, all the thresholds are now going to be frozen until 2026. So by freezing all the thresholds, taxes will start to make bigger and bigger inroads into UK assets. And if those assets are still in the UK, if it's property, it's still liable to UK tax. So you need to understand if you're going to get rid of that property as your main residence and what the implications are of keeping it, and what would be the implications when you get to France and maybe then need to re-engineer later on, potentially when you decide, yeah, this is the place that I want to stay. So it is quite a difficult balancing act, and it's one of those where if you arrive and then decide to stay later, the horse may have bolted while you're out, shall we say.
Okay, and to refer to another classic and one that we've had several questions on, what about rental from a UK property? How is that treated in short?
UK rental property is always taxable in the UK, but in the same way as I mentioned before, when we were talking about French property, because of the double tax treaty, there wouldn't be double tax paid. The tax that you pay in the UK, you get a tax credit for that and for the social charge in France. But you have to remember, going back to what I said before, tax in the UK is individual, and those thresholds are going to be frozen. So the amount of tax you will pay in the UK will increase over the next few years, and the amount of tax that you're paying on that money could be more in the UK than it would be if it was in France. Now, obviously, you can't pick that property up and move it to France. So it's one of those dilemmas when you do move to France, with the UK property market not being maybe as interesting as it was 10 years ago. It is a question of, do you keep a rental property in the UK when you arrive in France, especially over the next 5 years when taxes are all going to increase in the UK.
So when we hear this phrase, you're living in France and you're taxed locally on your worldwide income, you may well be taxed that way, but it is still the tax is still payable on a UK rental property in the UK as per UK norms.
Correct, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and again, an area we've had several questions in on. What about, and I'm sure quite a complicated area, what about pensions and how they are dealt with if one were to become a French resident?
That all depends on the type of pension, Andy. If you have a UK government paid pension, when I say government paid pension, I don't mean your state earning, your state pension. If you have a government pension, that light rental income will always be taxable in the UK. And as I said before, you would get a tax credit in France. Private pensions or company pensions, sometimes known as final salary or defined benefits pensions, they will become taxable in France. Now, initially when you move to France, the UK provider doesn't necessarily know that you're in France, and they want to make sure that you're paying your tax in the right place. So they will continue to deduct tax at source on that pension. Then, once you've made your first French tax return, you then submit the appropriate form, which is then effectively stamped by the French tax authorities to say, yes, this person is paying tax, declared this in France, paying tax on it in France. That goes back to the UK tax authorities. They then pay a credit to refund the tax that's been paid in the UK, and instruct the provider to pay future pension payments gross, not deduct any tax. Does that answer the question? It can get a lot more complicated than that, I can assure you.
Absolutely. Well, if people have more complicated affairs, then they can certainly contact you to ask that question. Yvonne, I think you want to add something.
Yeah, no, perhaps just to add one line, because that is a confusion that we meet very often with our customers when we explain to them that I have to do a tax return in France, and they say, oh, but I only have, for example, a civil servant pension from the UK. You have to declare your worldwide income in France, and then depending, as Rob just explained, to the income categories and the double tax treaty, then we see if this income finally is taxable in the UK, and there is a tax credit that applies immediately on the tax bill, on the French tax bill.
Okay, so that's covering some ground on taxes. Let's not move to the other inevitable, quite in depth, but let's move to healthcare, the bit that happens before you die, I guess. Joanna, when people come to you and talk to you about buying properties, I guess you have lots of conversations around access to the healthcare system and private healthcare. Given we're now out of the EU, the requirement is, I understand, around private healthcare, at least for a period. Can you tell us what's sort of involved with that and what people might expect to pay on a monthly premium?
That really depends on, you know, your health conditions. At the moment, the EHIT card that you could use from the UK is still valid until it runs out. Then when it runs out, you can actually apply for the new GHIT card, which is the Global Health Insurance card. That's basically if you are in France or visiting France, it gives you access to the health service like the old EHIT card would be. If you're going to become a permanent resident in France and it's not just a holiday home, then you would need to look at getting into the healthcare system, in which case you'd need a carte vitale. In order to get your carte vitale, you'd need to be able to provide your carte séjour or your residency permit to be able to live in France. And the carte vitale, that gives you 70% health cover. So the rest of the cover you would need to take up as an insurance. I mean, most insurance companies do that, so I would definitely shop around. And the cost of that, I would say it's a lot cheaper than it is than private health cover in the UK. And the health service in France is fantastic. I found it to be absolutely amazing, so that's really good. But you would need to get the 30% top-up cover if you are a resident in France.
So sorry, so the 70% is provided by way of?
That's the carte vitale. So that's the healthcare system in France. So whereas in the UK it's 100%, in France it's only 70%. So if you had an accident or whatever and you were in hospital, you would be covered for 70% of that cost, but not the other 30%. So you would need to top that up yourself. And that's why obviously everybody takes the insurance, because you never know what could happen or what hospital bills could be. So you would need to take out the insurance on the other 30%.
Okay.
May I add perhaps something to make things better understandable? In fact, if you want to enter the French health system, the French state health system today, you have 3 possible doors. Let's say it this way. The first door is you are working in France, you are employed by a French company, or you have a business in France. In this case, you pay national insurance contributions, and obviously that opens the door into the French state system. The second possibility is you have an S1, and some people might still be eligible for an S1. That means that finally your native country, the United Kingdom, would pay to France for your healthcare because you have or you are still paying national insurance contributions in the UK. And the third possibility is France has opened the doors to his state system in 2016 in a very generous way, and says, as soon as you have a stable and permanent residence in France for at least 3 months, you can ask to be affiliated in the French health system. And the bottom line is for people who have very few income, that will be free. For people who have very low work income, but an high income produced by assets, that means rental income, interest, dividends, these kind of income, they might be liable for a complementary contribution to be in the French state system.
Thank you. And just briefly for our audience, the S1, could you just explain what that is?
The S1, in fact, is a document that initially that is still a document between European countries, and that means that one European country tells the other European country that the person will be covered by the native country's health system in terms of they pay into for example, the French health system. Okay, that was something in the past up to Brexit, where all the state pensioners, someone who is entitled to a UK state pension, got automatically the right to apply for an S1, and that means that the UK pays France for your healthcare here in France, but you are affiliated in the French health system.
So that would in fact then cover the scenario of a British couple retiring to France with potentially UK state pension benefits. they would then qualify via that route, would they?
That was pre-Brexit. Post-Brexit, things that have changed, and we still have the hope that there will be some negotiations in the future about an agreement that would replace the European rules that we had concerning S1. So for the time being, the S1 is for those who are covered by the withdrawal agreement, so who arrived prior to the 31st of December.
Okay, and again, an area we had questions on, I don't know if you can answer this as well, Yvonne, is if people do become part of the French state system, do they rescind their rights to the national health system back in the UK, or is it possible to keep access to both points of care?
Today, unless I'm mistaken, if you are an S1 holder, you maintain your rights in the NHS system when you are back to the UK for visit, for example. But if you have left the UK definitively and you become a resident in France without an S1, I don't think that you are covered by NHS anymore as a visitor.
I think you are covered as a British citizen, though. If you're still a British citizen and you still hold a British passport, you would still be covered in the UK with the National Health Service. If you change your citizenship when you're not a British citizen anymore, then that might change. But as far as I'm aware, or I might be wrong, but if as a British citizen you still are entitled to the National Health System.
Perhaps something to look up. For me, it is really linked to your residency status. If you come back to the UK as a visitor, I don't think that you are covered. But perhaps something, if people have very specific questions to this, we can look it up for them on a more individual basis if they want.
Well, we will be following up this this webinar with a series of documents with all this detail. If any of you are busily scribbling away trying to recall everything that's been said, we'll also be sending you a recording of the webinar. But yeah, the pieces we'll be adding to our website will be next week. There is also a summary piece up there at the moment with some of the headlines from today's event. If we can, I think we will also add the URL for that French government website that Yvonne gave us. I see a number of people coming through on the questions asking for that URL, which we've been sending out. So we'll try and get that email address to you. So thinking back to these options and the different visas, I know, again, Yvonne, you said you just need to go through the process and see which one is right for you. But we've had a good number of questions in about working in France and what defines work. So if I work remotely, I see the Nationwide Building Society today has announced that they're going to be 100% remote for all their employees, no requirement to go into an office. They do have to stay in the UK apparently, but some companies are allowing people to work from overseas. If I'm working in France for a UK employer, am I working in France or in any way liable for income tax in France, or am I still paying that in the UK?
That's a very good question. In fact, the situation, someone living in France but working in the UK, there are two possibilities. Or you work in the UK physically. That means you are supposed to, I don't know, take a Eurostar, or that was in the past, take a Eurostar on Monday morning and take to London and come back on the Friday evening and spend your holidays or your weekends with the family. Then definitively you are a cross-border worker, someone living in France and working in the UK. Now, modern technology and COVID-19 has brought up many situations where finally the work is done remotely. And it is still a kind of question. I know that we had addressed some requests to local French tax offices for people in this situation. And they said if the remote work is due to COVID and to the special situations, you are still liable. You are UK resident for tax purposes. We will not ask you to do any tax declarations here in France. If you go for visa, a work visa, you need to have a work contract with a French company, with a French-based company. Be aware of the fact that in some situations, if you work in France for a UK company and you execute the work in France, that might implicate that your UK company would need to create an establishment here in France. So these questions are a little bit tricky, and you really have to discuss this with your UK company before you do the steps and take in account this very special COVID-19 situation. The administration, UK side and French side, I think, is a little bit behind to take in account the new realities of work that can be done remotely.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Rob, that some of this is as yet remains untested. Remote working in France for a UK company, what's involved. Equally, we've had a question in about maybe there is a more exact answer for this. If I move to France and buy up a gîte complex, if I'm running a gîte complex, is that deemed work? Therefore, do I need a work permit rather than a residency permit, Rob? What would be the situation there?
Yeah, I mean, if you move to France and you're going to run a gîte business, you're working. So there's no doubt it's a working visa. Just going back on what Yvonne said before, yeah, there are difficulties with COVID, but the situation with somebody working is reasonably straightforward. It's one of those issues that we've faced many times before, insofar as there's lots of Brits now, especially as we are talking today on Zoom and team meetings and the like, where actually all their work is being done in France. Now, that's really quite difficult because you're effectively doing your work in France. And therefore, if all the work is being done in France, your company should be paying French social charges because effectively that's where you're doing the work. Now, it may be that you continue to pay tax in the UK. No, that may be good or bad because, as I said before, tax is on an individual basis. And if there's a lady who's living in France and she's working and she's living there with her husband and she's the main breadwinner, and if you were able to be taxed under the French system, they would probably pay less tax than if she is being taxed in the UK under the individual system. Okay, so all their income will be taxed on her rather than divided between the two of them. So it's an issue that we've come across before, and it has always been this issue of where you used to be able to do no more than 20% of your work. So people who commuted, as Yvonne described before, typically what a lot of them used to do is they used to commute, do 4 days a week in the UK, then come back for a long weekend, whether it's on Eurostar or down to Nice on a flight on a Thursday night. And they maybe worked from their place in the south of France on the Friday, and then they had the weekend and then flew back on the Monday. It was always difficult to put a figure on how much time they were spending working in France. The sort of old rule of thumb was that if you do more than 20%, you were tripping into the stage of working from France, and therefore your French work or all your employment income will be liable to French social charges, which is not too onerous for the employee, but very onerous for the employer. So, certainly at the start of lockdown, there were lots of people who disappeared off, and this is 12 months ago, disappeared off to their villas in France and carried on working. And none of their colleagues knew that they were maybe in Bergerac or in Guildford. It made no difference. The background was the same as I am today. But actually, if you're not careful, you could be dragging your employer into some seriously heavy employer social charges.
So you see that as an employer liability potentially, not just the onus on the employee to declare where they're earning their income.
Absolutely. I mean, effectively, the employers allowing them to work from France, and allowing them to work from France, they're therefore liable to French social charges.
May I just jump back perhaps to the gîte question, because that is quite important, and I know a lot of people have projects around gîte and bed and breakfast. If you want to run a gîte business, that is a very special thing in France because it comes to furnished rental. And furnished rental can be, to make a long story short, and I'm sorry that we are not able to go in details this afternoon, it's really too complicated, but you can have a status as a professional or as a non-professional landlord, and the consequences are quite different. But in general, running a JIT is running a business, and that is not in this case a work visa that you need, but a visa for someone who wants to create a business in France. And here, the general rules today are that if you come to France with such a visa, you need to show your business plan. You need to show that your business project is viable, that you have enough money to support yourself, time the business is running, etc., etc. So do not cross the wrong box. If you want to run a JIT business, it is definitively creating a business. If it is a very small business, you might come under, let's say, the non-professional category. And in this case, you would come as an inactive, someone who enjoys life, to France. But that is something, as I said, quite complicated. And I would just recommend that you take personal advice on these questions before you make your decision.
Joanna, I'm sure you've had people looking to buy properties from you who one part of a couple may be a UK passport holder and the other half may be Irish or another EU country. One such person is Mary Conn, who's in the fortunate position of holding an Irish and a British passport. She's asking about moving to France with a British passport holding husband. Is that going to be an issue for her? Should she trade in the British husband for a French one, or is that all going to be fine?
What usually happens. No, I would. It's not really. Obviously the Irish passport, you don't have to apply for visas or anything else, because it's, if you've got European passport, you can move here, work here, and do whatever you like. The British passport, unless that gets changed to an Irish passport, and I don't think you can actually do that through marriage. I'm not sure. I would really suggest that you contact the British Embassy. The British Embassy in Paris is absolutely fantastic, and they're really, really helpful. Obviously British, and sort of ask them that question. As far as I'm aware, for the lady with the Irish passport, she doesn't have to have visas or anything, but the husband probably does.
Okay, anybody wish to add anything on that one?
No, I mean, just the same. If he is British, he can be here for a certain length of time, and then he will have to return or apply for a long stay visa.
Right, and while we have you, Rob, questions about inheritance tax.
I should get all. Should I?
You get all the fun subjects, don't you?
Absolutely.
In inheritance tax, we had a question in. Sorry, I don't know who this is from. Well, just identifies as a holiday home owner. So in inheritance tax, if you're still tax resident in the UK, then inheritance tax in the UK is a UK issue, I assume. And if she's French tax resident, it's a French issue. Would that be a reasonable summary?
It all depends on whether you thought it was an easy answer, didn't you? No, if you're a British resident and you have a French property, the value of the French property is liable to French succession tax. But more importantly, it's also liable to French succession law. So therefore, if you have lots of UK couples have spouse-to-spouse sort of options inside their wills, and if you, let's say that couple have got 2 children, and they don't take Joanna's advice when they buy it, and they simply buy it without taking any advice, they may have bought it incorrectly, and when one of them dies and they're still owning that property, not only have they got French succession tax potentially to pay, it might have to go, or a certain share of it would have to go to the children. Now that might not be in keeping with the testimony requirements. So you have to make certain elections or buy the property in a different way. But in a very simple answer to your question, if you're a British resident couple and you've got a French property, there is succession tax in France potentially to pay when the last one of you dies, because when assets pass between spouses, if you're able to pass it between spouses because of the French succession law, there wouldn't be any tax to pay at that point. But when the last one dies, when the survivor dies, there would be French succession tax, and also it would be allowed for UK inheritance tax. So in essence, you'd pay the higher off. And if the boot was on the other foot, and you're a French resident and you've got UK property, which is where we went a little earlier, the same situation applies. You know, UK property, all continue to be owned by French residents, is still liable to UK inheritance tax. And again, as I touched on earlier, that succession tax threshold is frozen until 2026. And actually, from an inheritance tax point of view, the threshold for UK inheritance tax has not increased since 2009. So actually, from 2009, the tax take on inheritance tax has massively increased because they've kept the threshold so low. So again, it's another reason why people need to consider if they keep UK property long term after they move to France, if France is where they intend to remain.
Thanks, Rob. And in our last few minutes, we'll try and jump around on a number of questions, but staying with finance, Joanna, we've had a question in from Martin Foster about moving what he says, a material sum of US dollars over to euros in expectation of buying a property in France, but asks about the timing and the availability of a bank account in France. At what point he can open a bank account in France? Does one have to have an address in France? What's the process around that?
Well, for US, I would imagine yes, it would be the same with the Brits now. You would either have to have a rental address or you know, a house that you're buying address. Usually, what we do with British clients and what we've been doing since Brexit is, as soon as the compromis de vente is signed, obviously then a transfer is going to need to be made either directly to the notaires or into a bank account. That document can act as with the bank to be able to open an account. So as soon as you physically have an address and you can prove that that's the address that you're going to be living at or renting at, then you can open an account. And it's going to be a little bit more tricky. It's going to be a little bit more tricky with mortgages now as well. The amount has gone up since Brexit. It's more, particularly for self-employed now, you can't borrow anything under 150. For employed, you can borrow 100. That's if you're non-residents and you're living in the UK. But yeah, so it has changed slightly, but I think you would have to have a proof of address to be able to open a French bank account.
Okay, thank you. And just a shameless plug, because Martin asks, and so does Alison Morrow, about currency businesses as well. So a place in the sun currency. Check us out on the website if you're looking for a specialist firm to transfer your funds. But you raise a good point, Joanna, on mortgages and mortgage availability. What sort of loan to value is available on a French mortgage for, say, a UK resident? A number of questions in about mortgages and have they been affected by our move from the EU?
It's actually more difficult now for someone like myself, for example, who's British living in France, to get a mortgage in the UK. It's almost impossible. But the other way around, it's not impossible. It's usually around 80% loan to value. Some banks will do 85% loan to value. The minimum amount now, we haven't been able to get anything under 100,000 as a mortgage. So you would need to be taking, 80% of the 100,000. So yeah, it's still not difficult. There still are lots of banks lending and you will still have to provide all the usual documentation. But I would say it's probably about 80% loan to value. What you said about currency is also quite important, because obviously with the rates going up and down and fluctuating, if you've got a good rate at the time, I would book your currency when you make that offer, if you can do that, because that could be the price of a new bathroom or a new kitchen, you know, if the rate drops and then you've got to find more money for the house, etc., etc. So currency is quite important. And I think a lot of people don't realise that when they're opening a bank account, they transfer through the bank. But actually it can save you quite a lot of money. So that was quite a good plug to make there, Andy.
Well, yeah, and other currency firms, as we all know, are available, but they generally offer a more specialised service than a high street bank. And yeah, that's the idea that Joanna refers to, of forward fixing a rate. So you put down a deposit, you secure a rate, and then you know what the final price of your property is going to be. Otherwise, you're open to the vagaries of the fluctuation rate on the day that you actually complete, and never actually know the final price. So that's something that we always advise people to at least take a look at, if not actually do. Good, thank you. Then briefly, given your residency, the time that you spent in France, Joanna, again, lots of questions. I am repeating myself on general cost of living in France and utilities and that sort of thing. Cheaper, more expensive than the UK?
Well, it really depends. I mean, EDF is in the UK and France, so your electricity is going to be exactly the same. Your gas is probably going to be the same. Some supermarkets are actually more expensive than the UK, you know, on certain products, depending on where you live as well. You know, it's quite seasonal in rural areas and countryside, like where I live. Whereas you can get absolutely everything if you went to Tesco's or Asda's in the UK. But the quality of life in France is what it's all about. And I would say that that's why most people, or most of our clients, move here, is the quality of life. You've got the space, it's huge. You know, the healthcare is fantastic, the education system's fantastic, the wine and cheese is fantastic, of course. So there's lots of reasons, but most of the reasons why our clients come to France isn't really for investment. It is for lifestyle. It's mainly for lifestyle.
Well, that leads us on to a question I was going to wrap up with from Catherine Stewart, who says, why should I retire to France rather than, you know, again, other countries are available, Spain, Portugal. You've just summarised what you love about the country. What about you, Yvonne? What's kept you there for 30 odd years?
I came for work. I stayed for love. That is perhaps the best explication for my personal case. No, but I completely agree with Joanna. And I think today, more than ever, people just should realize that if they have good reasons to relocate to France because they love the country, they love the language, they love French culture, they love a region in France, they should not just say, okay, now with Brexit, we can't realize our dream anymore, but just be aware that things need to be much more prepared, and they should take advice, not only the day they arrive, but just before, 3, 4, 6 months, a year before they realize their relocation, to make sure that everything is in place, that they did understand the consequences on their tax situation, on their financial situation, what administration steps they have to do, what papers they need. It is not like in the past. We have had people, they arrived in France with the dog in the car and their luggages, and then they enjoyed life for 3 months, and then they woke up and said, okay, perhaps we should do something now about our new situation. What do we have to do? I think that is something, unfortunately, that is no longer possible or really not recommendable.
So it's about the preparation. I mean, we have questions, one from Susanna Hallam, one from Geraldine West, echoing a similar sentiment, which is, in short, we'd be devastated to buy a home there and then find out that we couldn't spend extended periods of time in France. Would you reassure them then that if they do go about things the right way and have a certain level of income, then that's not going to be a jeopardy?
I think that is exactly what people have to understand. Becoming a French resident is finally not more complicated than before, despite what we all explained before. It is, you need a health cover, but that is something more than sensible. I don't know a lot of people that relocate to another country pre or post Brexit without asking themselves the question, am I covered for healthcare? And people need to have enough money to live on. And France is not asking for a lot of money. I mean, seriously, if as a couple you do not have something like 1,200 euros per month between you to live on, you should think about, is your relocation project realistic? So it is really, once again, there is paperwork, yes. That is, you all have birth certificates, you all have passports, you all have your marriage certificates. So that is not an issue to get these documents. And then it's down to, do you have a healthcare, and do you have enough money to live on?
So yeah, when you strip it all back like that, healthcare to keep you going and €1,200 a month. I mean, I think if that's one of the headlines from today's webinar, that is not an amount of money. Well, yeah, seriously, you should question yourself whether you can afford to move if you don't have those sorts of funds available. Rob, I think you mentioned the €1,200 a month. That's it's not a crazy amount of money, is it, for a couple?
No, not at all. I mean, you would expect that to be the norm. I mean, I would just add to what Yvonne and Joanna have said. Joanna, I think both of the ladies have a much more romantic approach to France than I do. That's probably what I've been doing for the last 35 years, involves finance. We have to remember that the UK has left the EU and we've had Brexit, but the double tax treaties are still in place. There is nothing different from a tax point of view. And I would say to you that in the past 25 years that I've been here, we constantly spend our time looking at, is it the right thing to do to move? Now, something that Yvonne mentioned before, the S1, inside the cooperation agreement that was signed near the death at the end of last year, the ability to have an S1 has been extended. So anyone who is arriving now who becomes eligible for UK state pension after the end of the transition period, they can still apply, or they can now apply, or can still apply for an S1. So that covers the health issue that Yvonne just mentioned. In 8 out of 10 cases, when we've compared, is your situation from a net income point of view better in France compared to the UK? 8 out of 10 occasions, France is better. And it's down to, in my view, 2 simple things. From an income tax point of view, tax is on the household, not individual. So it reduces both income, both sets of income, if there's 2 people in a household, to the lowest common denominator. The other thing I would say is that we have to remember that taxes in France start at much lower thresholds, okay? And they go to the same level as in the UK. So in France, the tax rate at the bottom level is 11% compared to the UK at 20, and it rises to 45 just the same as the UK. So I think between those 2 parameters, you can see that in more cases than enough, it's France that wins out when you look at it for a retired person. So I think it's an absolutely fantastic place for a retired person to come and live from a romantic point of view, but also from a financial point of view.
I have you down as a romantic, Rob.
You better have a call with my wife and explain that to her.
So we could go on and on. We have a ton of questions we've not got round to, so apologies if that includes one that you have sent in. We will be summarising this webinar, as I referenced earlier, in some blogs we put on the website next week. If you signed up to this webinar via Zoom, we will have your email address, so we will send you out that information. If you're watching on the live stream on Facebook, if you go to our website and click in the right-hand corner and register, then you will sign up for the information and we can send that out to you via that route as well. So, and of course, we'll also be publishing the details of the people who've taken part today. If you're looking for specific advice in the areas of estate agency and relocation and tax and finance and pensions from Rob, Yvonne and Joanna. So thank you everybody out there. I can see we've had a very healthy audience along today. Thank you to my panelists. It's quite a daunting subject. I think we've covered off a fair bit of it, but there is a lot of detail, as we keep getting reminded. But thank you to my panel. It was good to have you along, and it's goodbye from me, and it is goodbye from the panel.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.